Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Matt Fox, and this is Break a Read. Today, all the way from Tucson, Arizona, joining me is Trent Kynaston. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. And you?
I'm doing great. And I'm not in Tempe right now, but I'm sure the weather over there, we were talking right before I hit the record button, is just beautiful. And I'm really missing the West Coast right now.
Yeah, yeah, it's nice. This is a typical, kind of December
Right.
highs in the mid low 60s and lows in the low 40s. But we survive it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Over here in New York, I cannot say the same thing. But yeah, let's just go ahead and dive right into it. Thank you so much for agreeing to join me today. And I just wanted to get a little bit of background information about you, if that's all right with you. Would you mind telling me where you're from and where you grew up, where you went to school, and things like that?
Well, born and raised here in Tucson. Um, Graduated from the University of Arizona in '68 with a degree in music ed and saxophone performance. They told me that that was the first saxophone performance degree awarded there.
Okay.
And they didn't even have a saxophone teacher at the time. I studied with a bassoonist who doubled
Oh,
saxophone,
wow.
but no saxophone prof. And then I got a master's in composition in '69. During that year, from '68 to '69, I taught high school band and orchestra at Rio Mesa High School in Oxnard, California. And I had taken almost all of my academic graduate courses as a senior. I got permission to do that.
Okay.
And so that year I wrote a symphony and then came back over the summer and finished it up and did my orals and everything. So yes, and then I taught public schools, high school band, orchestra, junior high, uh, beginning band even for a couple of years here and in California, in Tucson, in California. And then got the job at Western Michigan University, and I was there for 39 years.
Wow, that's great. That's a lot of tools in your tool belt there. A lot of things. So how was it being one of the first saxophone degrees at University of Arizona? I'm sure you had to do a lot of self-teaching and practicing on your own, right?
Well, I mean, there was a little bit of that. My teacher, Wendell Jones, who was the bassoonist, and as I mentioned, also played saxophone as a double. He played shows and things like that. But he was an excellent musician, and so I studied with him. And with there weren't a lot of there was no YouTube back then, obviously, and
Right.
there weren't that many recordings out, but you kind of scrounged for them. So I had some Sigur Rosser recordings and Marcel Mule and Don Cinta's early recordings, and Vincent Abato, things like that, that you could kind of listen to and pattern a little bit of your development of sound and style and things like that with. But it's certainly not like it is today, where you have some
Right.
just unbelievable teacher performers that can lead you a lot quicker and solve your problems and discover your talents, I think.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So with that, I kind of want to segue. I know from reading up about you and having met you once before at the regional NASA at the University of Arizona a couple of years back, that you're very successful in both jazz and the classical genres, and that is a very big goal for lots of young saxophonists and aspiring musicians around the country. And a lot of times, people find themselves playing one or the other, and it's very rare that someone does both very successfully. And I had a couple of questions for you, like how did you go about performing and teaching both genres at a very high level throughout your career?
Um, I mean, I started out playing in jazz bands in high school, and we had a very active one, which was great, especially in the early, '60s.
Right.
That wasn't that common, and it was actually a class. It was a class that was paired with a college prep music class.
Oh, great.
So, when we weren't, getting ready for a concert or a dance or something that we would play for, we had we would have music theory class or whatever, which really prepared me very well for college because I tested out a lot of the early music theory
Right.
stuff. And there was nothing at the University of Arizona at the time. The only jazz that was ever played was a pared down version of the pep band that would play basketball games and stuff.
Right.
And occasionally for homecoming and things like that, that band would get together, rehearse a few, dance tunes and Johnny Warrington arrangements and some Sammy Nestico stuff, and we would play for dances and stuff. But I was interested enough in it that we had a big Phi Mu Alpha uh, group at the University of Arizona, and so within that, we formed a big band. I kind of got that going, and that's when I started writing, for big band, and so that was kind of the beginning of my interest. And so I'd always played it, but my study and my main focus in college was classical saxophone. So the jazz thing was just fun on the side to make money.
Right. Hmm.
And um, and when I got to the University or Western Michigan University, there was a jazz band there, but it had just recently been allowed to rehearse on campus. For many, many years. It was not allowed to do that. So the students met at a music store off campus to
Oh,
do it.
wow.
And so the second year, I soloed, performed with the jazz lab band there my first year as a guest soloist. And the students got really excited because I, kind of directed the band in the rehearsals and stuff like that. And they wanted me to conduct the band. So the next year we started the University Jazz Orchestra that I conducted for about 30 years. And so that continued my interest, obviously, in the genre and writing.
Right.
And a year after that, I started a group called the Western Jazz Quartet, which was a faculty ensemble uh, that continued through, through my retirement. And so it was always an important part of my love, but
Right.
the main focus of my teaching early on was classical saxophone. To the point that my first sabbatical in 1979 and 80, I went to France and studied with Jean-Marie Landex for a year.
That's great.
And I won the top prize there in chamber music, which is saxophone quartet and saxophone. And then came back, probably my strongest, um, classical chops.
Right.
And we began to start a jazz program at the university. And at first it was just an emphasis in jazz. So I wrote some syllabi for a or jazz history course and a jazz
Right.
improv course and a jazz arranging course. And we taught those, and the students who took all of those could get a certificate, a jazz certificate, attached to their degree.
Right.
Slowly developed um, into a degree program, an undergraduate degree program, and then eventually the master's in saxophone or in jazz performance degree. All along, I had to slowly kind of invert my priorities and my focuses. And so as
Right.
the jazz program grew, I had to develop skills or try to develop my skills a little bit, more in order to be able to stay above, in front of the students and to
Right.
successfully teach all these classes. Um, and so I began to transcribe both to develop my own skills, but then those transcriptions led into, I developed into books that I published. And these were, most of the transcriptions I did were ones that I thought would benefit my students and help them initially before they started to, do their own. And all of the books that I've published were, again, started that way. They were a means for me, something I felt my students needed.
Right.
And I do them both for my own edification, but also eventually would get them published and use them in my teaching. And to the point where when I finally retired, certainly by the early 90s, probably I was 50-50 in terms of my performances and
Right.
focus. And by the end of my career, I was probably doing 75 or 80% jazz and 20% classical performing. But of course, at the university, most of my teaching was classical because all the students have to go through that regimen,
Right.
whether
Hmm.
jazz students or not. So And so it just evolved more than anything else. I'd always had a love for it, but it was never my intention. It just kind of worked out that way.
Right. And I mean, it's really great to see because everyone has their own kind of musical path. And it seems that throughout your career, it's just kind of changed back and forth between your main focuses, like you said. And that's really great that, you were able to keep both up throughout everything and still, teach at such a high level for both genres as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely fun. I enjoyed it immensely. It was really
That's
hard to retire.
right, right. I can imagine. That's really great. And you mentioned about your publications and all your transcriptions. And having looked at your website a little bit, there's plenty that you've done. There's so much there. And that segues kind of into my next question. Would you mind telling me about the process of publication and transcribing, arranging, composing, working with publishing companies, and really getting into that area of the music industry?
Yeah. Um, well, as I said, I did the transcriptions initially for myself. I was trying to develop a stronger jazz focus and identity. And then as I did more and more, I kind of developed them into books. Sometimes just like I have a jazz tenor rhythm changes book and jazz tenor blues book and an alto blues book. And then I also did certain personalities, Michael Brecker, Stan Getz,
Hmm.
Joe Lovano, um, all these different players that I really enjoyed and my students were into. And I wanted to figure out what they were doing so I could, better address the issues and the ideas with the students. And I remember one time I was doing a festival in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I pulled out this. I think it was a Richie Cole solo on one of the New York voices or singer, Manhattan Transfer probably.
Hmm.
And I was talking about transcribing and showed a little bit of it, and then I played the solo along with Richie Cole. And one of the teachers there said, you should send that to Downbeat magazine. They would, they would love that because they publish transcriptions every once in a
Right.
while. So I said, oh well, I'll try that. And I sent it in, and they liked it and published it. I wrote a little kind of simple analysis of it. And so I sent them a few other things, and they always accepted them. And I copied them in my hand manuscript calligraphy, and I included just a little analysis and stuff like that. And uh, it wasn't too long before they were writing me or calling me and saying, "Hey, Trent, do you have a solo of Michael Brecker's? We're going to feature him in this issue in 3 months. Can you?" And I,
Hmm.
yeah, I've got lots of them. And then I go look for something to transcribe and send it to him. And that happened from like Wynton Marsalis or Kenny Barron piano solo or Stan Getz solo, or um, even one time they called and said, "We're going to feature Kenny G in an upcoming issue. Do you have a Kenny G solo?" I said, "Oh yeah, I got lots of them." Got the Kenny G recordings and found one and transcribed it and sent it in. And then out of that, I started to develop into the books. And initially, the books, all my transcription books, were self-published.
Okay.
And I, although I did publish a Michael Brecker book and a Stan Getz book and a Phil Woods book with a small music publisher in Lebanon, Indiana. It was called Studio PR. And they were very excited to take them, and they published them, and they did great. And then I found out that Phil Woods was suing. Well, before that, Studio PR was bought out by Columbia Pictures Bellwind, CPB
Okay.
Bellwind, which is a big company. I believe at the time it was owned by Coca-Cola. And so, there was no money to be had suing some small publisher in Indiana. But now Coca-Cola owned them, or
Right.
Bellwin owned them, and so Phil Woods sued them for it, and ended up getting back royalties, but nothing else. But they never decided who owned the solos. And he was also suing because I had "Just the Way You Are," that from Billy Joel's recording,
Hmm.
and Billy Joel's saxophone player was playing that solo every night with Billy Joel, and so Woods felt that he deserved, and probably rightfully so, some kind of compensation for the fact that somebody else was playing that solo that he created
Right.
night after night. At any rate, they declined that, and Studio PR or the Columbia Pictures sold the remainder of books that they had in stock, and then discontinued them because they didn't want to deal with whatever the legal ramifications.
Right.
And it was
Right.
at that point that I actually started doing it myself, publishing. I started my own publishing company, and I'd print 500, 1,000 books and sell them out of my garage, literally,
Wow.
to maybe a half a dozen big companies like Jamie Abersol and some European um, music distribution companies, and to individuals, just sending copies out. And
Right.
uh, so I continued that until I retired, and at that point, I just closed the company down, and just didn't want to deal with it anymore. But those books have been out there, and there are probably more photocopies of them are floating around than there are real printed copies.
Right.
And so that's kind of how the way I got into that. The daily studies book, the sax or the scales and
Hmm.
exercise book, and my circular breathing book were also published by Studio PR back in
Okay.
the late 70s, early 80s. And then those also were taken over by CPR Bellwin. Um, or, yeah, and then right now, Alfred Music owns them.
Okay.
So, and again, it was just all a process, just kind of do this and send them out and see what happens, and
Right.
and make some connections, and then follow up on those and continue to build like anything else.
Yeah, and that's really amazing to hear. And the daily studies book, along with a couple others, is something that I know I've used almost every day in my practicing, and a lot of my friends have too. And it's just such a great resource
Yeah,
for saxophonists.
yeah, that came about because when I studied with Londex in France, we had a technique exam, and you had to learn all your major harmonic minor scales in consecutives, thirds, and fourths at any given tempo with a dozen different articulations. And early on, they had a technique exam, and you prepared one etude, and then they selected an etude from the list of that you had.
Right.
It was a jury, and then they also would quiz you on these scales. So you'd walk in, and they say, "Okay, I want to hear the E flat major scale in fourths, slur three, tongue one, slur three, at quarter note equal 120." If you weren't playing the second they finished talking, then you got points. If you had to
Wow.
think, okay, E flat in fourths, ta da da ta 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 da da. Okay, I got it. You were already losing points.
That's
And,
intense.
and so, and then you played your etudes and you crested one, and then the next morning you walk into the conservatory, and a big bulletin board right out in the lobby are everybody's names and their scores.
Oh, wow. So it's
So
just out there for everyone to see.
everybody to see, no anonymity whatsoever. They just strip you bare, and there you are. And so out of that, I thought, well, I need a better technique scale, arpeggio regimen for my own students. So I took that idea, and I actually wrote the scales,
Right.
arpeggio, tuning, all of that stuff. And again, that was published early by that small company in Indiana, and they got it started.
That's great. That's a really interesting story about that book. I would never thought that. And just the idea of, because we do technique juries at ASU, but the idea of having your scores just right there for everybody to see is very frightening. And that's definitely not something that we've done.
Well, I remember the etudes too. I was playing Loyon etudes at the time, and I was number three or number four. I believe it's in E flat. And it's got a half a page with no place to breathe, and then another half page.
Right.
And so I used that to demonstrate my circular breathing. And,
Okay.
and, I played it from memory, which you seem to play everything from memory, which is great. But I played it from memory, and then they asked me another little one. I think was in 516 out of that book. I can't remember what number it was now, but I remember that was part of that technique exam. But again, to
Hmm.
have scale, I mean, you have your, actual percentage or score posted for everybody to see, and not only that, but you could see how everybody in your class did too, because there were
Right.
dozens of saxophonists, that went through that. So
Wow. Well, with that, I kind of want to move on to a story that Dr. Creverson shared with me about, ASU. That's where I currently go. And he mentioned that you had toured with the band years back, and you met with Paul Creston and worked with him. Is that
yeah.
true? Yeah. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Well, I was teaching. My first 2 years of teaching, 68 through 70, were in California, Oxnard, California. And then I moved back here, and I was teaching at a junior high school and 4 elementaries that fed that junior high school. And I got a call from the band director at ASU, and he asked me if I knew the Chorale Husa concerto and if I'd be
Mhm.
interested in playing it with the band. And I'm not sure how he got my connection. It may have been through Husa, I'm not sure. But at any rate, they were doing, the University of Michigan had just premiered the Apotheosis of the Earth, Chorale Husa's piece for band.
Mhm.
And ASU was going to give the second performance of it, and they were doing a whole Husa um, program. So they did Music for Prague and the Apotheosis and the concerto. And
Okay.
so I learned the concerto, and I drove up to Tempe and rehearsed with the band, and did all that stuff, and we performed it in Grammy, um, in the big auditorium there. Great,
Right. Gamage. Yeah.
Grammage,
Gamage.
Grammage, and then we went on tour. And as I remember, I didn't play the Husa on tour with them. We went to a lot of small towns in southern Arizona. I have a program here that I found not too long ago, but I think I played another piece that was a little more presentable for a high school,
Hmm.
group of general students usually that that you do when you do those kinds of tours.
Right.
I don't remember what that piece would have been, but at any rate, yeah, that was a great experience. And I remember the Husa Concerto is such a bombastic piece with a full kind of symphonic band, and the acoustics in that auditorium are so good that even when the band was blasting, people said you could hear the saxophone just as clear as a
Yeah.
bell, and it was really, really very nice.
Yeah, it really is a beautiful performance hall. Um, so, would you mind telling me a little bit about your work with Paul Creston?
Well, again, I was invited to perform at Portland State University, and they were doing a Creston festival. Creston lived, I think it was, well, lived in a small town just north of Portland
Okay.
in Washington, and taught there at a small school. And they had invited him down as the guest of honor. So they played several of his band pieces, and we played the concerto, and we played the sonata, and he accompanied me on the sonata. So it was a great experience. I mean, I was really nervous. I was maybe,
Right.
I don't know, 24, maybe 23, 24 years old, maybe 25. I can't remember the exact date, but we went into the rehearsal. We played the piece down, and he was in the audience, kind of with his score, watching. And the only thing that he complimented me and thought performance was great, but the only thing that he got on me is that I took the ending an octave higher.
Of the concerto.
Yeah, the D
Yeah.
D6 chord that runs up to an F sharp.
Hmm.
I just continued up to a double F sharp at the end, and he wasn't happy with that at all. He says everybody takes it up to a high D, and he said, that I think was the tonic, and I took it up to the F sharp, and he said if I'd wanted that, I'd written for soprano. I play it as written, so I played it as written, and then he came up and sat down at the piano during the rehearsal. The band took a break, and we just ran the sonata straight through. And he was very complimentary, and I mean, he played it great. But I remember he took my piano part, especially in some of this in the second movement. He started crossing out all these notes. He said, "All the," he was a kind of a portly, short Italian gentleman,
Hmm.
and he had very short, stubby fingers. And so, he said, I'm like, I was young when I wrote this. These aren't really necessary. And so he was erasing, getting rid of a lot of these tenths and big intervals that were in the left hand, that some pianists struggle with. So, um, but yeah, we just played it straight through, and that was it. And then on the concert, we did it both. We did both pieces, and it was a real thrill.
That's really something. And from what I understand, that accompaniment for pianists is one of the hardest saxophone pieces. And I guess the phrase "don't write something you can't play," that
Yeah,
doesn't apply to him. Like he definitely can play it.
yeah, yeah. It was funny too. I remember one time when I was a student, I was playing it. I must have been a sophomore, maybe a junior, I don't know, but I was playing it and programmed it on a recital, and my pianist came in with me, and we played the piece through, and my teacher sat back in his chair and he said, "Wow, Trent," he said, "that's the first time I've heard the piano part played better than the saxophone part." And I said, "What?" "Oh." Yeah, that's one way to cut you down in a real hurry, especially with that.
Yeah.
So I stepped it up a little bit.
Yeah, that's really funny. So, with that, I want to segue into just general life throughout the pandemic. I know we're all kind of meeting virtually right now through Zoom, and even with the regional NASA conferences coming up, they're all going to be online, which is going to be great, but it's going to be a little different than what we're used to. Since March, has anything about your daily, day-to-day life changed?
Well, it's funny you ask because I can't imagine being teaching and dealing through this pandemic. Uh,
Hmm.
but I'm retired, and
Right.
so my life has changed very, very little. I don't go out to eat at all anymore, and my wife and I don't go to movies anymore, and
Right.
we try to limit our visits to the grocery store and everything else, being quote in that vulnerable age.
Right.
Uh, um, we try to be safe, you know, and prudent as possible. But so my life hasn't changed, much at all. Not in comparison to what yours has as a student and how you
Right.
deal and what your daily routine is now, or somebody who's actually teaching at this time.
Right.
So, I've said many times it's a great time to be retired in terms of that issue. We get out a lot by ourselves, and I play golf quite a bit, but there's a lot of social distancing and masks and everything,
Right.
being done. Um, and I haven't actually seriously, I've played the instrument a few times, but I haven't really practiced or I haven't performed for over 6 years now.
Okay.
And I had some issues with my hands. I had a condition on both hands called Dupuytren's contracture. And
Okay.
it's apparently mostly hereditary. If you have Scandinavian heritage, you've got a much better chance of having this issue.
Oh, okay.
It was once called, or it's often referred to as the Viking claw, because uh, what happens is a tendon in your hand starts to scar up, and your finger, and it can be more than one, it was just my little fingers on both hands, but your finger starts to curl up like this and you can't straighten it.
Huh.
And it can be, I mean, it can be your whole hand.
Right.
Usually it's one or two fingers, it's down here. And so, I'm poking myself in the eye and I can't grab stuff. And it happened on both hands, and you can still see this finger is still a little curved.
Right.
It's much better than it used to, and I still can't comfortably reach a B flat with this finger, and
Right.
it's hard for me to have any dexterity with E flat to C. I
Right.
can play the saxophone from D up, and not worry about that, but these fingers are very stiff and they don't move very well. And so, when you can improve, and at best you can't even maintain, at
Right.
a certain point you have to say, okay, I did my thing, and I thought that in retirement I'd gig a lot and play a lot of jazz things and just lay back and enjoy myself. But as it turned out, I played for about the first 3.5 years of my retirement, and had fun with it. But then um, had to. I lived up in the Phoenix area for the first 3 years, and I played with the Super
Okay.
Jazz Orchestra out of the Phoenix College, and
Okay.
so that was um, that was really my main outlet until I moved down here and just had to quit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems that you're enjoying yourself in Tucson and there's beautiful weather,
Yeah,
all the time, which I really do love that about Arizona. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today. And, the title of the show is Break a Read. And I hope you have a read with you that you'd be willing to break on camera.
actually, I have to tell you a funny story, because when you asked me about that, the first thing that came to mind is that I was an undergraduate, and I was playing a lesson. And after I finished playing whatever it was, an etude or something, my teacher said, Trent, can I see your read? And I said, sure. And so I took it off the mouthpiece, and I gave it to him. And he looked at it and he held it up and kind of studied it. And then he yawned and leaned back and shoved it into a wall and just broke a reed.
Right.
And then he looked at it and said, oh, I'm sorry. You have another, don't you? Well, it was his subtle way of telling me, that one's got to be retired. It's time to move on.
That's really funny. Dr. Robert Young is the saxophone professor at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, and he used to teach at SUNY Potsdam up in upstate New York. And I used to go to the summer camp called Crane Youth Music there, and I remember vividly one of our studio classes during the camp. He was talking to a student, and he was talking about the wall test, and he was like, "Have you ever done the wall test?" And I'm pretty sure the student must have just played or something, and they have the student take off the reed, gives the reed to Dr. Young, and he goes, "The wall test is really simple. It makes your reeds play much better." He goes up to a wall, boom, right against the wall, just snaps it in half. And the whole class, I remember, was just like, whoa. Yeah,
Well, that was my introduction to make sure you got a good read when you go to a lesson.
definitely. All right. Well, with that, I have a reed too that I'm willing to break. This one hasn't really been serving me very well. So you can break it however you'd like. I'll count down from 3, and then whenever you're ready.
All right.
All right. 3, 2, 1. That was perfect. Great. Well, thank you
So
again so
I can
much.
take this and trim it down a little bit. I'll probably get a few more days out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you have a read geek, you can trim it out. It'll be okay. Thank you again so much for joining me today. And I hope you and your family have a great holiday season and you stay safe.
Great. Thank you so much, and same to you. And when do you graduate?
I graduate this May.
Ah,
Hopefully we'll see how this semester
yeah,
goes, but I should be on track to graduate this May.
no doubts. I have no doubts. You're an amazing young player, and I see nothing but great stuff in your future. So just keep on keeping on.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a great rest of your day, okay?